Fitzgerald to St. Colum's. Over the course of our visits and lecture series, we're delighted to be able to have to the college distinguished guests who have been outstanding in their own field. And today, of course, in welcoming Dr. Fitzgerald, we're aware that we are in the presence of a great man who has done great things in the whole life of Ireland over the last number of decades. I know that we wouldn't be able to have Dr. Fitzgerald here if it wasn't for the good work of another of our past pupils, Mr. John Hume, who's a great friend of St. Colum's and who is always very anxious to assist us in any way in accessing key speakers and in developing the college here. And for that I'm very grateful to you, John, indeed. And I would like to invite John now to introduce our guest speaker to us.
Fellow women and students, it's a great honour for us today that a man of the national and international status of Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald has accepted our invitation to come and celebrate the 125th anniversary of this college. We owe him a deep debt of gratitude. And of course, as Taoiseach, always in his public career, peace and justice in our part of Ireland was always at the top of his agenda. And indeed led, as Taoiseach, to the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which will go down in history as the first major step in our peace process. Because for the first time, the British government accepted at his request that the Irish government must also be involved in any resolution to our problems. So we owe him a deep debt of gratitude on a lot of fronts, but in particular for coming to us today to celebrate the anniversary of this great college. Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald.
The word lecture, I didn't know I was getting a lecture. I didn't know I was to talk at all until I arrived here. But if I have to, I'll do my best. My background is a bit unusual. My father was London Irish, Roman Catholic. My mother was the daughter of a prominent unionist businessman in Belfast, managing director of Royal Irish Distillery, largest distillery in these islands. He is an odd man, but he since one thing. He had 5 children, 2 were clever, 2 girls, 2 boys and the other girl weren't, so he sent the 2 girls who were clever to university and didn't bother with the others. The boys were sent to the colonies instead, I think. And my mother, probably in university, became a Republican socialist suffragette. It was very upsetting for a decent Presbyterian unionist businessman. As a daughter, went to London, did training for teaching there, and eventually came home, but I looked out the window, joined my father and married him in London. And then later on, my father moved independence. They're both GPO 916. My father's first foreign minister of the Irish state. My mother disapproved of the whole thing. After I was born, she wrote to a friend in London to say that De Valera had made the same mistake the other side, compromised by forming a constitutional party, and she hoped the government would be thrown out as soon as possible, even though the only income of the house was my father's income as a minister. So, somewhat divided background between North and South, between Protestant and Catholic, and between Republican and Free State, I suppose you'd call it. So that meant I had to think as I was brought up. I did once ask my parents about the Civil War, and neither would tell me what it was about. I only discovered what the Civil War was really about and what happened in it when helping my younger son with a school project many, many years later. There weren't any books on the Civil War even at that stage, that occurred after the foundation stage. But the nature of things, I had an interest in Northern Ireland which was different perhaps from others. The only problem was, the only people I knew in Northern Ireland were my relations who were all Protestants. They didn't know any Catholics. So in the 1960s I decided to go into politics in the South and had to come north and look for Catholic politicians to find out that side of the story. So for a Southern politician it's a slightly odd way into politics. That's, by the way, the first introduction. Maybe a word first about politics. I don't think anybody goes into politics who hasn't a sense of service. It may be a desire to serve people locally, maybe a sense of being able to do something for the country as a whole. But I don't think anybody at all enters politics without some sense of service. It's also true that nobody enters politics who hasn't a touch of vanity. You want to, you're rather pleased to be prominent, put yourself forward, you wouldn't be involved. So you can take it that all politicians are a mixture of vanity and service. The ratio ranges from 5 to 95% in either direction, but they're both present there. And the difficult thing about politics is this, that most of the things that need to be done, for politics should be about changing things by definition. There's no point in not trying to change something. What are you doing politics for? If you want to change something, the people who don't want change are against you. And you'll find that most changes are resisted by somebody, by many people, and often by interest groups who do well out of the present system. So if you're going to do anything useful in politics, you have to challenge interest groups and do things that are unpopular with influential, powerful, and often wealthy people. On the other hand, if you make it a career, and there are very few part-time politicians nowadays, if you want to make it a career, you have to make sure you get re-elected. Otherwise, your career terminates. You're unemployed and find something else to do. So every politician has to judge in everything he says and does between achieving something useful, changing something, even despite opposition, and getting re-elected. And that range of choices means that there's a constant dilemma. And actually, I during the last war, watching what was happening, seeing the moral dilemmas that some of the politicians faced during the war, decisions like dropping the atom bomb, bombing of Germany, and so on the Allied side, never mind the other side. And then in an occupied country, were you for Pétain, who took on the job of looking after the French people under occupation, or de Gaulle, who left to carry on the fight from outside? Each had a role to play. And I was always struck by that, and it struck me that politics, if you went into politics, you ended up with a lot more moral dilemmas than otherwise. You hugely extended the range of moral dilemmas, because so everything in politics is a moral dilemma. There's always a choice. If I do this, I'll be unpopular, I'll be re-elected. Well, I better do something popular, I'll never be re-elected. And if I don't do something useful and unpopular, there's no point in being here. So politics is a very unusual career. And because politicians face more moral dilemmas than anybody else, having to make these choices, and people see them doing them, and see them at times protecting their own interest about being re-elected, even though it being a somewhat cowardly thing to do, people see in the public gaze politicians acting often in ways that don't seem very brave or good. The rest of us, people who are not in politics, don't have to display all this in private. Their private life's their private life, and people don't see them making decisions of this kind. So politics is very vulnerable to external judgments, because people can see wrong things being done, mistakes being made, and people acting weakly, and they should be acting strongly. So just when you think about politics, just think about it in those terms. And it's because those constant little moral dilemmas and small issues, what you say on a particular occasion, you're trying to curry favour, you're trying to talk straight to people whether they like it or not. That is very important to understand what politics is about. Let me say a word now about the history of our island over the last century or so. The division of the country, which began in 1914, was effected in 1920 in final terms. Part of the reason for that was differences in British politics. Leave aside what people here wanted or didn't want. There was a British political dilemma. Parties trying to get the better of each other in Britain. And to some degree, Irish affairs were used by English politicians in their own circumstances, their own benefit, one way or the other. But anyway, the end of it was the country was divided. You can argue the merits of that, rightly or wrongly. But after that, Northern Ireland was left to itself for 50 years. Now, I think that reflected a great failure by the governments of both states. In the Irish state, there was to be a boundary commission. The Irish government very naively expected that large chunks of Northern Ireland would be handed back to the south. That didn't happen. They misjudged the wording of the boundary commission in terms of reference. They were shocked and horrified to discover that very little came back to the south, and some bits of the south were handed back to the north. And they panicked. My father's a member of that government, and did a quick deal to leave things as they were. And at that stage, I think Irish governments, my father's government, subsequent governments, really opted out. They decided they burnt their fingers in all that, and let's get on with founding our own state. And founding your own state is a big job, I can tell you. Because naturally, people in our state who are predominantly of one tradition had an inclination to try and create a state in the image of their own culture, a monocultural state, predominantly Catholic and Irish-speaking. It would be unrealistic to expect them not to do that when they had the opportunity by being given 93% majority in their own area once the division took place. But what they didn't realise was, of course, in building up their own state in their own cultural form, they were dividing Ireland much more deeply. If you actually look at the facts, the British divided the country, but the changes that took place subsequently were much more in the south than the north. We cut ourselves off to our own kind of state, without much regard for the north, and there weren't that many changes in the north. For good or ill, the north tended to stay the way it was. And I don't think people in the south realise how difficult they were making life for many people in the north by dividing the country more deeply. They were thinking of themselves and their own state they wanted to establish. And a state which eventually became very successful, although there were a long time about it, first 35 years. It wasn't exactly very brilliant economically, but eventually it worked out well. But there was neglect by Irish governments. In 1938, issues of discrimination in the north were raised by Mr. de Valera in his negotiations with the British government. The Home Office, which was running Northern Ireland affairs, had one objective. We managed to get out of Northern Ireland, don't let's get involved again in any part of Ireland. That meant if anybody raised issues of discrimination, they didn't want to know about it. And a report was produced for Mr. de Valera's benefit saying no discrimination in Northern Ireland. He wanted to argue that, but eventually his colleagues, I think, persuaded him, you're not going to get anywhere. Settled for getting the ports back, which had been under British control until then, and for settling other differences between Ireland, North and South. Ireland was in the south of Ireland, Republic, and Britain, and don't keep pursuing this northern issue, you get you nowhere. And I'm afraid he settled for that. And I don't think any Irish government after 1935 gave any serious thought to Northern Ireland. And indeed, when the troubled violence came in the late 60s, Irish governments were totally unprepared, with no plan, no thought, no civil servant, no minister giving any thought to it. So I think we have to carry a lot of responsibility for whatever went wrong. But the British government, of course, has to carry responsibility because they were in charge. And the 1920 Act made provision to deal with discrimination. And when that issue arose, the British government funked it, decided not to intervene, because the Northern government might resign if you pushed them around, and we'd be involved again. They opted out of their responsibilities throughout the period, and had this extraordinary rule that you couldn't raise anything about Northern Ireland in the British Commons, in the sovereign parliament of the United Kingdom. So there was no way of raising issues in the British Parliament. So the problems of the last 30 years in Northern Ireland, or 35 years, derive from domestic problems here, of course, from your history. But they weren't helped by two governments who consistently opted out of their responsibilities. And that's what politicians sometimes do, because it's the easy way out. If you have to tackle something like that, the British felt, oh, if we started tackling it, the government would resign in Northern Ireland, we'd have to run it again. We had enough of that over a few hundred years. And the Irish government felt, well, look, we've enough to do establishing our own state without getting stuck into problems in Northern Ireland. So the opting out, understandable, human failing of taking the easy path. And of course neither side realizing that by not tackling whatever problems there were, they were building up a discontent which eventually could blow up. And neither government realized that. In fact, in the mid-60s, when the Mass and meeting O'Neill, most people thought, oh, things are getting better, tensions are diminishing, it'll all work out very well, and you, of course, just leave it alone. Nobody outside understood the kind of tensions that build up in a community when problems are not tackled, and people are left with increasing discontent on one side and fear on the other. And of course, behind all this lies fear. Fear is the one thing that distorts